Good evening to everyone here in Oman, and good morning to Dr. Paul and the team back in the US. So we welcome all of you here tonight in our webinar, the sixth webinar of this program. And before we start, we always would like to repeat and to say this program consists of 6 webinars. So tonight we have the last one, and we hope just for the first phase of this cooperation. So inshallah, we hope for many webinars to come inshallah soon. So this program actually derives from the collaboration between the National Museum, the leading museum and the flagship cultural institution in the Sultanate of Oman, which are represented by the Learning Center, and the Smithsonian Institution, one of the world's largest museum and research complex at the United States. Also, the Smithsonian is an outstanding cultural center. We don't forget to send our appreciation to the US Embassy in Muscat for their constant support and sponsorship of this program and multiple projects. We know that they're always here to support. This program actually will be on the 21st century curatorship for the Omani Museum professionals, the specialists, and the students too. Also, this program will elevate the museum's industry and the knowledge of individuals, enterprises. We had 5 webinars before, and those previous sessions were about visitor service and greeting and ticketing, and crowd management, and the history of representing cultures in museums and cultural centers, with an introduction to the Smithsonian. Also, we had virtual exhibition and other museums uses of the web. All were presented by Dr. Paul. Then the fourth one, it was a case study on the money as material culture collection and curation at America's Money Museum, and this one done by Mr. Douglas Matt. And the last one also done by Dr. Paul Michael, who is our presenter for tonight's session. Then the last one, it was about developing dynamic programming and visitor engagement. For tonight's session, we have a topic of the activities of a modern museum or cultural center thriving in the 21st century by Dr. Paul Taylor Gate. For those who are attending the webinar for the first time, we would like just to remind you that Dr. Paul Michael Taylor is a research anthropologist at Smithsonian Institution since 1981. So we're talking about 40 years of experience at Smithsonian. So it's so great to have him with us. And he's the curator for Asia, Europe, and the Middle East in the Smithsonian Anthropology Department. In addition to that, he serves as the director of Smithsonian Asian Culture History Program. And as we know, he received his bachelor degree from the University of California at Los Angeles in 1975, and his PhD from Yale University in 1980, and both of them actually in anthropology. Dr. Paul also, he has an author or editor of multiple books, scholarly articles on the ethnography, ethnobiology, arts, and languages. We always share the link where you can view or download some of his papers and job. Dr. Paul also curated 24 museums exhibition, and 5 of them were virtual exhibitions. And as this experience for Dr. Paul, he received, as a result of this experience, he received countless awards and grants from different countries in the world. Kindly, before we start the topic or the webinar tonight, we ask you here to mute your mics to listen, to hear Dr. Paul very clearly. And we wish Dr. Paul and the team all the best. And at the end of this presentation, we're going to hear your comments or inquiries or any questions. And yeah, if you can turn on your mics and you can do it orally. So we thank you all, and we thank Dr. Paul and the team. And Dr. Paul, it's your turn, and wish you all the best, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Isa. I'll begin by sharing my screen, if I may. I hope you can see it now with the title slide? Yes.
Yes,
good. And
it's very clear as a crystal.
great, thank you.
I can see it.
And I'm going to move the other things out of the way. The topic of our discussion today is the activities of a modern museum or cultural center thriving in the 21st century. As we start, I, of course, want to, besides saying good evening to all our colleagues and friends in Oman, in the Sultanate of Oman, I also want to thank very much the National Museum and its Learning Center for kindly hosting this entire series, as well as to thank the Embassy of the United States in Muscat for their much appreciated support. Now, because this is the last in this first series of 6 webinars, I'll be essentially summarizing some of the things that we've talked about and using the concepts we already talked about to apply them in practice to the idea of how museums can become real centers of cultural life. And in that sense, museums are more accustomed to being, or more able to be, the idea of a 21st century museum as a center of cultural life. However, there is no reason, if we look at the definition of a museum, that this is required of a museum. There are other kinds of requirements. And not only that, but as we'll look in this 5-part webinar that I'm going to show you the outline for now, many historic sites actually are traditional cultural centers in their own ways. And some of those historic sites have become museums. Those are a very special case. And in an ancient, important, historically, society like Oman, that is a very important special case. Not every museum needs to be the same. And I'm going to use some examples, not from Oman, but from Indonesia, of very traditional places that were already centers of culture before they became museums, and then managed to have those traditional roles interact in various ways with the concept of a modern museum. But most of our museums are not those exceptional cases. Most of our museums are the newly constructed, recently constructed museums that are the product of the museum concept, which, as we discussed in our very early second webinar, are the product of a long series of transitions from the Renaissance cabinets of curiosity through various directions in the history of museums. Part 2, we'll just briefly review something that we looked at for other purposes in a previous webinar, also in our webinar 3, which is the different types of activities of a modern museum. Part 3 will look at how we can integrate those various kinds of activities. I mean, things like the exhibitions and outreach and education and research. And it's going to use as its example a re-examination of one of the examples that Douglas Mudd provided in our 4th webinar, which was about a case study of the Money Museum, for which he serves as director. I'm going to look at and show you some new slides about one of the exhibitions that he talked about, to see how that got selected and why it was an important exhibition from the perspective of building a thriving cultural center. In part 4, I'm going to do that also with 2 of the projects and exhibits and integrated activities that I have used in several of these past webinars, our Korean Heritage and our Sikh Heritage project, both of which had at least one, sometimes more than one, exhibition associated with them. And then, having shown a number of these different programs from this perspective, part 5 is what I call a virtual roundtable. The reason I call that a virtual roundtable is that in prior examples or cases where I have given major seminars for museum professionals in other countries, you know, in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, just in Korea, in many places. I've always done that in person, you know, with people all there, and where I could walk around their museum and talk to them and listen to them and see the place and hear what they are interested in and what they feel they would need or would be useful. And I miss that with the webinar format, but here we are during a global pandemic, so the webinar has some advantages. And I'm hoping nevertheless that inshallah, as our plans, we hope to be able to visit our colleagues and friends in Oman in the future and in person continue this discussion. But in a roundtable discussion in the prior examples after seminars, we actually have this expression roundtable in English. The table, in fact, does not have to be round, but what it means is that people all sit around a table and they discuss ideas and they brainstorm and come up with thoughts about the future. So in thinking about museums as cultural centers, I hope that we will begin, just for a few minutes at the end, a dialogue about possibilities for the future of Smithsonian partnership with Oman. Now, this is not a finished plan by any means. It's just the beginning of brainstorming. And as we know, in brainstorming sessions, they are most useful if everybody's brainstorming and coming up with ideas, and then out of 100 ideas, maybe 95, 96, maybe 99, maybe all 100 end up being thrown in the trash can and something else gets done. It's no problem. You can still speak up. But I just am going to show a few images that I used in our previous webinar too, about our collections from Oman, historic material, royal gifts from the Sultanate of Oman in the 19th century, to indicate that there are some possibilities. Doesn't mean we have to do them, but it means that we invite everybody to think about how we can apply the ideas that have been expressed, not just today, but in our previous 5 webinars as well, towards developing interesting new initiatives that help all of our museums become centers of cultural life in new ways. So first, let's begin with the local historic sites as museums and as traditional cultural centers. And for that, I'd like to go back to one of my first big international partnerships between when I was still, I wasn't a new curator, but I had been at the Smithsonian for about 10 years or so. And we began a partnership with the National Museum System of Indonesia, which at that time was in a period of really wanting to build up its museum system and initiated having provincial state-run museums in each of the provinces. For that, I'm going to go back though to something that I showed in webinar 2, and that's the ICOM definition of a museum. I think that many people listening now, I'm speaking of the fact that I understand the webinar will be translated into Arabic and used again later also. Listeners may be not, some of them in the field of museums or museum studies, and students studying museums. I wanted to mention that the museum has a specific definition, and that's the one we're normally using. It's a non-profit permanent institution. It's open to the public and it has collections. However, as I mentioned in webinar 2, I want to also emphasize that many things are called museums that don't meet this definition. They might be for-profit organizations, for example. And in the same way, students now and staff and faculty of museums who are studying museum procedures should know that there is a market for this kind of knowledge outside the world of museums as well. And we won't have time to go into that in detail, but one example is that one of the best investments that many corporations have made has been in their art collections. And those collections need curators, and in many ways function like museums, except that the objects are assets that the corporation owns and can be purchased and sold. But in terms of monetary value, they've gone up faster than many, many other assets. So the techniques that people need to manage a museum are similar techniques to those needed to manage such collections. There are many other examples besides this. I do want to encourage students to learn about the kinds of information that we're sharing in these seminars, not only from these seminars, but from many other ways of learning. Now, so in the case of Indonesia, I mentioned in a couple of the past webinars, including the one on program development, number 5, that we look at what a museum is trying to accomplish and develop programs that can accomplish that. In the case of our Indonesian traveling exhibition, which is on the right in this slide, the entrance to Beyond the Java Sea, Art of Indonesia's Outer Islands. It's an exhibition that I curated and opened in 1991 here at the Smithsonian. The museum from which we borrowed a lot of the material was the National Museum of Indonesia. And remember, their purpose was different from what other purposes were to some extent. They had examples like this object on the left was rather damaged, needed cleaning, and they couldn't identify exactly what it was because the information about it was somewhere in the records, but the records were not able to be used to properly identify it. In fact, it's the ornament for the front or prow of a large boat on the island of Borneo. So they wanted to be able to clean things like this and fix them and find out about them. That was their goal. But as you can imagine, it's hard, as I said at the time, it's hard to find people willing to give you a lot of money to clean something up in your storage room and then put it back in storage afterwards. That's not a very visible, attractive idea for a project. So we need to find ways to make them more public, which means that ironically, it was easier to find the funding for this massive exhibition of Indonesian art that traveled to over 7 venues on 4 continents than it was to find the money just to do some restoration and cleaning work, which would have been a much smaller amount of money. So sometimes it's easier to plan for a big thing than a small thing. But in the course of that, the government of Indonesia also wanted a training program. So part of our training program was to have Indonesian museum staff involved at every phase of that project. In the course of that, though, and here's where I'm getting to on this topic, I was traveling to lots of museums around Indonesia. The really interesting thing is that you had a lot, because it's an ancient society, you had a lot of historic sites that became museums later. Here's one, the Sultan's Palace on the island of Ternate in eastern Indonesia. Actually, our oldest writings on paper in the Malay or Indonesian language using Arabic script are from this place, because this was the center of this clove and nutmeg trade. And I spent a lot of time there, and I joked with people here that this was the area that Christopher Columbus was trying to reach when America got in his way. But the Sultanate was formally abolished in the Republic of Indonesia. However, the Sultan's family and all of his retinue and so on carry on and actually have a very important traditional role in society. So to the extent that the Sultan's family and his entire, we can say like a cabinet of officers in a traditional government continue to be active, the museum is almost like it's two completely separate places with two separate managements. One, it's a governmental structure within the Indonesian National Museum system. And as such, it doesn't really meet the standards of a modern museum. It doesn't have the good temperature and humidity control, the good catalog records, or it doesn't have any online presence, there's nothing. But one of the ideas of a modern museum is that it should be a cultural center, a center of cultural life. And this museum in that sense is a very, very modern museum. It's one of the most modern museums. So because it has such an important role for the culture. Here's an example of where every day you have people coming in with bottles of water and little offerings, placing near the room in the Sultan's palace where the crown is held, and praying for that influence from the power of the Sultan to come into the water, which they will then take back to sick family members to help them heal their sicknesses. This is the kind of one of many examples of the traditional role that the Sultan and the Sultan's family had in Eastern Indonesia. Here again, it's the building. And you know, at one of the points when I was working in this museum, going through their collections, which I've done every few years for a while, we had some commotion suddenly, and people started saying, you know, we should be leaving now. And I do speak Indonesian, and I asked what's going on. And a person had passed away, had died in the nearby town, right just outside the walls of the Sultan's palace. But that person had a role in the Sultan's traditional government. And so these people all began assembling, including some of the museum staff, but not the directors and the people who were hired by the government. And people who were working at the airport, you know, teachers at schools, suddenly left their jobs, put on traditional clothing, and gathered at the place of the deceased. And essentially what we have is one of the many occasions in which the cabinet of a traditional government, unrecognized by the formal national government, forms. And that cabinet basically has a role as a kind of separate manager or set of managers to the museum, even though the museum is now technically the property of the government. Here's the crown, my assistant photographing this and other things there. This crown, the hair, sorry, let me go back. The hair of this crown is said to magically grow every year, so there's a ceremony in which it's cut each year. But this is the kind of thing that is happening in traditional historic sites all around Indonesia that have become museums. So these, if you look at the criterion of a modern museum as being a cultural center for the local people, these museums, whose entire catalog records is just these old books that list the objects, and in there among the objects, the collections, it lists the tools that are used for gardening and the chairs and everything else that people sit on. So their cataloging methods, their online presence, everything else is zero. But by the standards of a modern museum being a cultural center, these are some of the most modern museums in the world, ironically. I want to start with that assertion. But I will mention that Indonesia's more recently made museums have been trying to appeal also to local populations. However, a museum, unlike a zoo, is not something many people even have an idea of what's going to be inside of it. And we have the issue that to make a museum about cultural life in a place with a very, very active cultural life right outside the museum presents some difficulties. I use this example now. It's a different part of Indonesia. It's the most famous internationally part of Indonesia, probably. It's the island of Bali. And here's the big witch figure, Barong, on display in the museum. And the museum, constructed in the 1930s, is on the model of a traditional sort of town hall. Balai Desa, they call it in Indonesian. Here's another of the figures that is frequently used in processions, and a close-up of a Barong figure. But you see that the difficulty with getting people to go inside and see the museum is that right down the street, these figures, these Barong figures, are being used almost every day in ceremonies, and lots of tourists come there, but also local people participate. So the museum is then challenged to become a cultural center when the real cultural center that they would be talking about in their museum is actually right outside going on in everybody's presence, so nobody needs to go to a museum to see it. So this is a challenge too for some places that want to build modern museums. Well, you can face this issue in many different ways. In Bali, which is one of the great examples of this kind of problem, if we want to call it a problem, we have a museum that is rarely visited by local people, but since Bali is such an important international destination, and tourists expect that museums should be on their list of things that they see when they go to a country. So they naturally assume, if they arrive in Bali and they're looking for things to do, that they should go see, among the other performances and things that are all around them, the temples and whatever, that they should go see the museum. And that's the majority of the people who come to the museum are international visitors. So you have a museum that's set up to be available to local people, but mostly its audience is international. Then the museum figured out, what can we provide to local people that they cannot easily get elsewhere? One is contemporary art. Of course, tourists buy a lot of contemporary Balinese art. So contemporary Balinese art is everywhere. What the museum is able to employ then is the function that we sometimes call in museum studies canonization. Canonization actually is a word from the church, which means that the church recognizes a person who has died as a saint. They're canonized as a saint. This is a metaphor, of course. There's just it doesn't mean that the museum decides who's a saint, but it means that there are thousands of Balinese artists. The canonization function means that it's like to be able to have an artist that is a local artist displaying in your museum is a way of canonizing, that is recognizing as a master, a particular artist. Now that is a very important function for museums, and museums can make the most of it. When you have a country with a lot of artists, the museums have a very important functions, and this role, when people take them seriously, is one of the central roles that museums can play in not only encouraging the arts, but also encouraging export and international recognition of your artists. So they have a section about contemporary art of Bali and some information about artists. The implication for the tourists, of course, is that you can go buy things from this artist elsewhere, not in the museum right there, although gift shops may have some. But it helps the artist become, and it not only helps the artist become better known, but also the artists themselves, when they're selling their works elsewhere on Bali, can point out that we are exhibited in the Bali Museum. The other area that is simply not available locally is archaeology. So you find the museum bringing together archaeological finds and putting those on display to talk about the prehistoric or early historic background of present-day Bali. That's something you don't observe outside the museum. So this is something that for local people and international audiences is new. So this is how museums are addressing the topic of trying to become cultural centers when they have so much competition right outside the doors with an active cultural life. I'm going to close this discussion about Bali by showing a very interesting picture. I actually used this in my book on Indonesian art in jeopardy, about the dangers that traditional art was going through in Indonesia, when areas, types of art that were at risk of becoming extinct and so on. Talking about how museums are basically a European import most places. So it's the modern concept of a museum derived through the series of processes that we talked about in our second webinar on history of representing cultures in museums, derived from Renaissance Europe. And through a series, we made some art museums and some scientific museums and so on, but it's fundamentally, as a European concept, was carried elsewhere. In the courtyard of the Bali Museum from the 1930s are these anonymous stone sculptures. There's one of a Chinese person, and one of a person from India and so on. This is the statue of a European. So it reminded me, as a kind of metaphor, this statue of a European on Bali reminded me of the metaphor for the museum itself. It's something that is a European import, but Bali has taken that European import, and like all the museums of Indonesia and many other countries, has made that European import something distinctively theirs. This is most definitely not a European statue. It's a statue of a European, but it's definitely Balinese in its character in every way. And that's what happened with the museums. Now, having said that, in that old museum in Bali, the 1980s, 90s, and more recently brought a wave of new museum construction. Those were the official museums for each province. This is an example from the province of Nusa Tenggara Barat. That's the island of a series of islands that is north of Australia, part of Indonesia. And the display methods are somewhat standardized like this. And the architectural features are basically a widespread Indonesian architecture, but always with some decorative motifs from the individual province, often combining motifs from different tribal traditions into one. So that's, I would say, a pretty common worldwide method of creating museums nowadays that are set up by governments with all of the normal museum goals, and they do meet the definition of a museum, the International Council on Museums definition, and they do have very interesting collections. But it is a challenge for such places to become centers of cultural life. They often don't really fit into any kind of traditional pattern of living the way those historic sites did that became museums. And I just will, in the section 1 on historic sites, I just will close with some other variations that are between, you know, historic sites that are completely unlike museums, and then museums that try to become historic sites and centers. So here's another traditional house. It's not a sultan's palace. It's a traditional tribal chief's house on the island of Nias, which is west of Sumatra. A very beautiful, interesting place filled with artworks. And is this a museum or not? It's a very interesting question. The chief still claims the house. The government claims it's a historic site. They've made it illegal for him to sell any of the artworks that are on the walls and so on. You can go in and talk with them and have tea with them. I've done this with many places on Nias as I've traveled through Nias, but it's not really open to the public unless you're invited. So I don't know whether it really fits the definition of museum or not. but it's a historic site. And it's on lists of historic sites, and it's protected in some ways, but it's also almost like private property in other ways. I also will say that the definition becomes complicated in other ways. Museums have a very important role in preserving historic sites, but when we talked about uses of the web and IT in museums, we also remember in that webinar, we used this example, which was the geographic information system use in Los Angeles, where you take a map of the city, and all of these little places that it shows here are historic sites in their own ways. And this is just one example in their database that you can go to, and it's a building. It's it shows the address on Buena Park Drive in Sherman Oaks, which is a city in greater Los Angeles area. And it has all the information about it and so on. So historic sites can be associated with museums like this. And each of these has its own activities. Some of them are private houses, but some of them are things like theaters that are historic theaters, and those have their own activities. So we're looking at historic sites and things that became museums and things that are in between museums and historic sites. This is a very specialized area of how to thrive in the 21st century. And museums are wise to adapt their activities and their initiatives to such kinds of places. Nevertheless, that's the end of part one, and we're mostly talking about museums that are the normal museums that are recently constructed and are important, central to a museum system in every country. And let's just review that something we have mentioned in previous talks, which is the activities of a modern museum, in order to take those and look at how those activities can be integrated with each other and how they can be selected so that we build museums that are cultural centers. So starting off with exhibitions, for example, we have the various components of exhibitions. The case study that we used in our webinar series in webinar 4 was the Money Museum, was primarily talking about their exhibits, and I'll come back to that in a moment. These are some of the activities listed: concept development, design development, project management, audience research, and evaluation. We also have another of the activities of museums, which is education, schools and interactions with school groups, whether school group tours or reaching out to the schools to bring them, bring your museum to the schools, making them familiar with the things that are happening in the museum. Adult programs, meaning non-school age kids, tours for kids, and materials that are developed specifically for educational use with families or with schools. And in the case of our Sikh exhibition, I'm showing this brochure that was done as a family guide to the exhibition. Also outreach, which includes getting the museum outside of the museum's walls. And that includes lending your collections to other organizations and doing traveling exhibitions. Research, and I used the example that you see in the background of the 1926 McGinney exhibition, By Airplane to Pygmyland. That's only one of many examples of publication of source materials and research results. Collections, this includes managing the collections that you have, conservation work, restoration, giving people access, use, and also it includes deaccessioning and disposal, as well as developing your own collections, improved storage, handling, borrowing, and so on. Oops. Sorry. Yeah. So those were the activities of the museum. Now we're at part 3, is how to integrate those activities. And for that purpose, I'd like to go back and look again That's something that Douglas Mudd talked about in his talk, and then look at it from a new perspective. I don't think you saw this slide in that talk, but this is the exterior of the Money Museum. You see some of the signs for their exhibitions, Money and the Civil War and so on, Faces of Money. This is in the state of Colorado in the United States. Now, he did not show this slide, but this is the entrance to the exhibition that he did talk about, called Money of the World Today. Now I'm looking at it not from the same perspective he looked at it, but I'm just using his example to talk about how this integrates the various activities of a museum in a way that builds your mission, not just your status as a cultural center, but every aspect of the museum. So it's the subtitle is, it's the portrait of global money and currency. Sorry, let me get this back. Okay, here's the next slide. Here's an entrance to the exhibition about Australia and Oceania. And I'll just go quickly because there are a couple of things I want to make comments I want to make about this exhibition. You'll remember he showed the introductory panels about Europe, and also he discussed how the exhibition was organized by geographic regions. And its case panels, as well as, this is talking about the different areas of the Pacific, and in each case, all of these sections of the exhibit about the different parts of the world also had cases with coins and paper money in them. So obviously this is an example of the activity of exhibitions, but I want to point to several other of the activities. He mentioned that sometimes people donate, everyday coins from all over the world, and when they have enough copies and duplicates, they can use them as little rewards for kids who get assignments to do things in class relating to the exhibition. There's an example of educational activities. And in addition, I want to bring up an important point about this exhibition, which I'm not sure if he mentioned this in his talk. I think he did, but it's why this exhibition was also important for collection development. You see, coin collectors usually don't go around collecting all the standard money that's available from just all over the world. And it doesn't really have high value. It doesn't have high value, but if you want to get that collection from all over the world from just the last 10 years, now is really the best time to do it before it has any high value. Because a lot of people have just brought stuff back from everywhere they travel and they just left them in a drawer, and they wouldn't mind just giving them to you, especially if they knew you were doing a project like this. So this exhibit topic, which was serving the purpose of educating kids and adults about the geography of the world, was also their way of developing their collections. Because like most numismatic collections, they were very poor. They have very few examples of the most modern coins and paper money. So they asked everybody to please contribute this. And they even contacted people in other countries and said, could you, find some examples of your coins and send them. So they built up their collection from all the countries of the world, even addressing the topic of, what are the geographical areas and countries that they need most, and so on. And so by picking this topic as an exhibit topic, they actually developed their collection. Now we do that sometimes, and we're going to be talking about other examples, but sometimes it's not that we want to develop our collections, but we want to get conservation work done. That I will interrupt my discussion of this exhibition to say, in the Indonesian exhibition that we showed you and began with, for the Indonesian materials that we borrowed from Indonesian collections, not the ones from the Smithsonian, we preferred to borrow material that was badly in need of conservation, because the budget for the exhibit allowed us the opportunity to do the conservation work that was needed. Not only it allowed us the opportunity, but because the development of that exhibit was tied to a training program for Indonesian museum staff. And those staff came here and participated in the conservation work. For all those reasons, that kind of collection work, in this case, collection restoration or collection conservation, became one of the goals of the exhibition. But it was a hidden goal. Just like in this exhibit that he talked about in webinar number 4 that we had a few weeks ago, this goal of building up their collection of recent money that they had very little of, so that they have now a really big, beautiful collection of all the most recent coins and paper money from around the world. That goal was a hidden goal. You don't walk in and see a big sign saying, congratulate us on this exhibit. We had almost no recent coins from Argentina or Chile or Paraguay or Uruguay, and now we have lots of them from every one of those countries. They don't say that. They just introduce people to the geography of the world and the history of all the parts of the world by using money, which often shows on the paper money and its heroes of the country, stories to be told, and so on. Okay. How about outreach as well as educational activities for children? Remember, he used this example, the passports. So this is something that kids get. They can get a passport to go through the exhibit. And then at different sections of the exhibit, things happen. They can meet docents, they can meet people who tell them about stories from those countries. And then they can get their passport stamped as having visited that country. So this is a kind of kids version of a passport that you get stamped when you actually go to real countries. So these are the kinds of things that make an exhibit interesting for children and make kids a challenge, because they're comparing with each other, and one says, oh, did you get to Japan? And the other one says no, and then they want to go to see Japan and get their passport stamped and so on. So these are examples that I'm giving you here, building on his example about the Money Museum. I'm trying to use this to show that all the activities of a museum, not just exhibit, were integrated in this project, a bigger overarching project of which the exhibit was a part. So that webinar was really about developing exhibits, but now I'm talking about the activities of a modern museum or cultural center thriving in the 21st century, and integrating all those activities, including exhibits, is how you do that. So I'm going to go quickly through the other examples because we don't have much time. The Sikh Heritage Project, I've used this before, but this is from the Natural History Museum. And we have used several times before the example of our Sikhs Legacy of the Punjab exhibition, of which we have several publications, including this catalog, which is done by Dr. Robert Pancion and myself. And also I have the example of the Korean exhibit. When I was talking about developing programs like this, I said at the time, that was the last webinar, I said, this is some ideas of how you can develop a good program, like the Sikh Heritage Program. However, I am not addressing at that time the issue of why you picked those projects, why you selected that program as opposed to something else. It says that that's a different topic, which we'll talk about later. So now here we are at the last in the series of webinars. I do want to talk about that project, that topic, why we select some of the projects that we do, the exhibits that we do, the initiatives that we do. Okay, now, so then I'm going to have to tell you a secret story, which very few people know, which is why we selected Sikhs and Korea as two of our big projects. And the answer is indirectly in the official guide to the Smithsonian that was published very briefly in about 2004 or so. And it was superseded later by a new version right afterwards. But in that version that was published, it had the Sikh Heritage Gallery. And the description was the first in a suite of Asia galleries scheduled to open over the next decade. This exhibition introduces Sikh religion and culture through artwork, jewelry, books, and weaponry. Many pieces are on loan from the Kapani collection. Later in 2017, by the way, I did publish the beautiful book on the Sikh art from the Kapani collection. And so that was a continuing interest of our research. Now, that information was quickly outmoded, but this is the map in that guidebook. By the time the guidebook was published, and the Sikh Heritage Gallery was actually, sorry, the Sikh Heritage Gallery actually appeared, it was not in the location that shows up in the guidebook. It was in a completely different location. And the basic reason is that this guidebook and the organization of the whole exhibition, as well as Korea and in a series that was planned, was part of a different plan that was called Vision 2000. And this diagram is, I'm not sure when it's from, but sometime in the 1990s, when 2000 was still in the future. And by the year 2000, we hoped that this vision would take place, that we would have peoples of Asia. Let me show with my cursor. This is Peoples of Asia. This area was closed. It was just a storage room and hadn't been developed to become a good exhibition space. And by the way, just jumping ahead, this later became our Korea gallery. That's the other part of this secret story. So I was always hoping that we would find a way to add this to Peoples of Asia, since I was responsible for that crowd. So anyway, it was a wonderful exhibition opening in 2004. We thought that it was the first in a series of exhibitions to become Peoples of Asia, but it didn't turn out that way, because by the time we opened, and this was the slide I used in our early webinar about the visitor services and so on, but it was a wonderful opening. And now in the post-COVID world, the exhibit is continuing to travel, but we can't have openings like this without social distancing. But what I want to say about the opening event in 2004 is, by then the museum had changed its plans, and it was no longer going to have a Hall of Asian Peoples. That whole idea of having big halls relating to the various parts of the world had been abandoned. Long story, but what we were left with then was the Sikh exhibition and the Korean exhibition. And the idea of the Hall of Asian Peoples, as it was called, was actually that we were looking at different identities and how people developed their identities. So Sikhs are considered both an ethnic group and a religion. That's kind of identity. Korea also is not a country, you notice. Taiwan was another topic where we were going to look at Aboriginal Taiwan and versus the Han Chinese later immigrant population of Taiwan. Interesting places, interesting issues of identities throughout Asia. The whole concept was abandoned, but we had two orphan exhibits out of that earlier plan, one on Sikhs and one on Korea, and both were extremely successful just by themselves. But the secret story of why the two of them were planned is as part of a larger hall, which never happened. Nevertheless, just very quickly, the integration continued with all the different parts. This is one section in the part that I just showed you about the history of Sikhs and the Punjab. And I want to mention that the collection improvement that I talked about when I discussed this continued. So this was conservation. Would have damaged the medallions showing the people in the court of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So at the end of the exhibitions in Washington, before it started traveling, all the collection items that were on display were in much better condition than when it started. This is some of the research products of that. The Fresno exhibition opening in California as it traveled. That's me. And by the way, this is in a Gurdwara or Sikh temple. As a sign of respect, people always cover their heads in the secret Wara. That's why people are wearing the turbans, and I also was covering my head, as you see when I gave the talk about the exhibit. This is the opening event in California. Another and this is also during the openings elsewhere. You had turban tying exhibition showings and so on. So there were a lot of outreach and other integration of activities, but that's the reason why we had it. Similarly for the Korean Heritage Project, and that's, I call it a project, not just an exhibition. It was founded in 1985 for a set of purposes. Exhibition was only one of them. The fact that we had good collections led us to set up a project, which actually included a lot of different things that were possible, not just exhibits, publications, but lectures, performances, and we had many. We had early exhibitions in 1987, just a few of our objects and so on. I opened an exhibit of contemporary Korean ceramics, some of which came back when we did our Korea gallery and were shown in a section of the gallery. A photo exhibition in 2003 celebrated the 100th anniversary of official Korean immigration to the United States. And that traveled to Los Angeles, as you see on the lower left, and we issued invitations. But our big effort was when we started working officially with government organizations in Korea, and this is the signing ceremony for a memorandum of understanding with the Korean National Folk Museum. So that's where we were in Seoul when we planned ahead to be able to open in the year 2007 our Korea gallery. And I want to show you the location because you'll see that's the Constitution Avenue entrance of our museum. You'll see that the location is one that I was finally able to sort of get for the Hall of Peoples of Asia. It's that section of the museum which had previously just been a storeroom. We managed to get very considerable funding from foundations and other supporters, support from the airline for round trips to Korea, lots of wonderful things to be able to actually take that space and convert it into usable exhibition space and put the Korea Gallery there, again, as part of our planned series on various identities of the peoples of Asia. So Sikh heritage was going to be right below that. You see where it says 24, that's the name of the hall. And then Korea there. And then we had many other examples, Taiwan and Malaysia and India and so on. I have to say that the Peoples of Asia plan was a very large long-term plan. And I knew at the outset, at the rate things change, it might not ever happen. But I figured, you know what? If it doesn't happen, its component parts will still be worthwhile. And that's exactly what happened. We're very fortunate that as a result of starting this project about Korea, which had that as part of it, as its justification, that it was going to be part of the future hall and set of activities about Asian peoples, we were able to find the funding to take essentially a storage room, clean it out, and actually completely redo the walls, the electricity, the lighting, and everything else, make the windows bomb-proof, do all kinds of wonderful things. And it was a transformation that over time, I was very proud of. We set up a design, which I described briefly in some of our previous webinars, and built a really beautiful exhibition in that space. And it was quite a wonderful opening event. It got lots of publicity all over the United States and Korea. So this is what we like to do. We usually have a big picture reason for it, but you know what? I'm proud to use these examples, even though the original big picture plan never happened. Both of these exhibitions were very, very successful in their own right. And I want to mention, although I don't make slides about here, but we have quite a few good publications. The catalog of the Korea Gallery, our various studies of Korean art during the Korean War, Korean ceramics as symbols of identity and so on. And I have made sure that these copies of these publications were sent to Oman, to the National Museum collection. And I have tried to send them also to the Sultan Qaboos University, all our publications, including this one. So as we conclude our last webinar in this series, I'll just take a few minutes of conclusion to talk as a sort of virtual roundtable. A roundtable in English is an expression that doesn't require a table that's round, but that was the original idea, that everybody sits around a table and discusses. Well, this is a webinar and I'm the only one talking, but I'll finish and open up the discussion. What I really want to do, though, is open the topic and then continue it, inshallah, when we visit Oman in person and we have the opportunity to really see the situation in the museums and cultural centers of Oman, which I'll be much more familiar than and able to have reasonably intelligent, hopefully, discussion by then. But I do want to just finish with a few slides that I have talked about before during the earlier webinar about museums of the world, of our own collections from Oman, like this transcription of the original 1839 letter from His Majesty Sultan Said bin Sultan Abu Saidi of Oman to President Martin van Buren, of the originals being in the archive, or this cashmere shawl, which is also one of the original gifts to President Martin van Buren in 1840. Here's a detail of that shawl and the catalog numbers there. Now, our original ledgers had information about the gifts to the president from His Majesty. This is the original handwritten cards listing violet, pearls, diamonds, and so on, which are in our collection. Here's the letter from the President of the United States to the US Congress, explaining that he has received these presents and he's not lawfully allowed to accept them without congressional permission. This gift actually was very important in the history of the United States, partly because of its effect that Congress sort of changed the laws as a result, or indirectly as a result of this initiative, so that when an official of the Smithsonian receives a gift from a foreign government, we no longer have to do what the president at the time said, which is that he tried to write back and say, "I'm sorry, but I cannot accept," which was totally an inappropriate thing to say, required by our laws. So he said he was going to be, asking the Congress about it. Then he had to ask the congressional permission to accept. So they changed the rules after this, so that when an official of the Smithsonian or the President of the United States or anybody else who's a federal employee gets a gift of this kind, they can accept on behalf of the United States, and the gift then becomes property of the United States. They don't have to turn it down first and then get permission. Anyway, it was a complicated matter at the time, but as a result, the collection has a very interesting history and ended up here. And it is my great honor to be the curator of this historical material from Oman, which is so important to us as Americans to have in our national collections. As with the case of our early Korean diplomatic collections or others, where we began a sort of project with various museums of Korea to do something about them. And in the course of that, we heard from our friends in Korea what they would like to see happen. Maybe they had some ideas about representing Korea to American audiences, in ways they would like to do, sending performances here and so on. So we were able to build a good partnership. And it is my sincere hope that inshallah, insofar as we can be helpful in achieving any of the goals of our good friends and colleagues in the National Museum or other cultural organizations of Oman, that we at the Smithsonian can be helpful in that way. And it is my sincere wish that we will be able to continue to work together in a very productive way. So once again, I first and foremost want to thank the National Museum and its Learning Center and Mr. Isa and all of the people who have been so helpful here in hosting this series of webinars, which comes to an end now. I also thank the U.S. Embassy in Muscat for their support of this series. And I also thank the Smithsonian team who has been helpful from the beginning and continues looking through our collections and finding some very interesting discoveries that we have made, actually, which I look forward, inshallah, to in person, bringing to Oman and discussing with people there. Thank you so much for your attention and for your time, which we know is very valuable. I look forward to any questions or comments now or later, inshallah, when hopefully we are able to meet in person. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Paul, for everything since day one, and for all the cooperation of all your, team members, and you especially, to make this webinar more successful, as I believe myself. So thank you so much for everything. And as you said, if there is a question or an inquiry or any comments, you can do it, guys, now. If you don't have it, maybe you can even send some inquiries which need more time to be answered to Dr. Paul and the team, and I believe they will answer it with happiness. So guys, any questions from the audience to be delivered to Dr. Paul and the team? And Smithsonian institution in the US for everything. We complete 6 webinars, 6 sessions, let's say, and we hope to see the next phase of this cooperation between both, let's say, institution as soon as possible. And of course, there is an invitation to you, Dr. Paul, and to everyone to visit the country. Inshallah, we can see you and we can absorb some of your experience, which is very, very great experience. We can absorb it here and we can apply it at the National Museum and myself in person. So thank you so much, Dr. Paul, and just have a good day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too. Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.